My RV trip to the Grand Canyon was supposed to be a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I've been dealing with a lot lately: work pressures, family issues, you name it. So, when my friend Marvin suggested we take his new RV for a spin, I jumped at the chance. He's always been the adventurous type, and I figured some time in the wilderness would do me good. Marvin picked me up early in the morning, and we set off with the sun rising behind us. His RV was a beauty, fully stocked with everything we'd need for a few days away from civilization. We had fishing gear, a small portable grill, enough food to feed a small army, and most importantly, a couple of six-packs of our favorite beer. Marvin had even brought his shotgun just in case we encountered any wildlife. It seemed a bit overkill to me, but he insisted it was better to be safe than sorry. We arrived at the Grand Canyon around noon. The view was breathtaking, with the vast expanse of rugged terrain stretching out as far as the eye could see. We found a secluded spot to park the RV, away from the main tourist areas. It was perfect, quiet, serene, and with an unbeatable view. The first day was uneventful. We hiked a bit, fished in the nearby river, and enjoyed a barbecue as the sun set. Marvin was in high spirits, and his infectious enthusiasm soon lifted my mood. As the night fell, we settled in by the campfire, sharing stories and reminiscing about old times. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. The next morning, things took a turn. We decided to explore a little deeper into the canyon. Marvin had found a trail on one of his maps that led to an old abandoned mining site. It sounded interesting, and we both agreed it would make for a fun adventure. We packed some essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and set off on foot. The trail was narrow and winding, with steep drops on either side. We moved carefully, using our walking sticks to steady ourselves. Marvin was ahead of me as usual, his boundless energy propelling him forward. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the occasional call of a distant bird. After a couple of hours, we reached the mining site. It was eerie and desolate, with rusted equipment and crumbling structures scattered around. Marvin was fascinated, snapping photos and examining everything closely. I wandered off a bit, drawn to a small cave entrance at the edge of the site. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Hey, Marvin, check this out," I called out, shining my flashlight into the cave. The beam of light revealed a narrow tunnel that seemed to go on forever. Marvin joined me, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Let's go in," he said, already stepping forward. I hesitated. Something about the cave felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Are you sure? We don't know how stable it is." "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Marvin replied with a grin. "Besides, we've got our flashlights. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, I followed him inside. The tunnel was damp and cold, the walls closing in around us. We moved slowly, the beams of our flashlights dancing on the rough stone. After a few minutes, we reached a fork in the path. Marvin chose the left tunnel, and we continued on. That's when we heard it, a faint rhythmic sound coming from deeper within the cave. It was almost like drumming. Marvin's eyes widened with curiosity, and he quickened his pace. I struggled to keep up, my unease growing with every step. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber. In the center, illuminated by our flashlights, was a makeshift camp. There were blankets, cans of food, and even a small fire pit. But what caught my attention was the figure standing at the far end of the chamber, partially hidden in the shadows. "Who's there?" Marvin called out, his voice echoing off the walls. The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and eyes wild. He looked like he hadn't seen another human being in years. His eyes locked onto us, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "Welcome," he said, his voice raspy and broken. "I've been expecting you." Marvin and I exchanged a glance. This was not what we had signed up for. "Who are you?" Marvin asked, taking a cautious step back. The man ignored the question, his smile widening. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone almost gleeful now. "You can't leave." Before we could react, he lunged at Marvin, a rusty knife in his hand. Marvin managed to dodge, but the man was fast, unnaturally so. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it directly in the man's eyes. He recoiled, giving Marvin enough time to pull out his shotgun. "Stay back!" Marvin shouted, aiming the gun at the man. The man froze, his smile never faltering. "You think that will help you?" he taunted. "You're trapped, just like the others." "Others?" The word sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the chamber, noticing for the first time the dark stains on the walls, the scattered bones partially buried in the dirt. We had stumbled into something far more sinister than an abandoned mining site. The man cackled, the sound echoing through the cave. "They all thought they could escape," he said. "But this place, it has a way of keeping you." Marvin fired a warning shot, the blast reverberating through the chamber. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he seemed to feed off the tension, his eyes gleaming with madness. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking now. Marvin nodded, keeping the gun trained on the man as we slowly backed toward the tunnel. The man made no move to follow, his laughter fading as we retreated. We navigated the tunnels as quickly as we could, the sounds of the cave now feeling oppressive and malevolent. When we finally emerged into the daylight, we didn't stop running until we reached the RV. Marvin locked the door, and we both collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" I panted, my mind racing. "I don't know," Marvin replied, his face pale. "But we're not staying to find out." We packed up our camp in record time and left the Grand Canyon behind. The drive back was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The experience had shaken us to our core, and the sense of relief we felt upon reaching civilization was palpable. Months later, I still think about that man and his warning. We reported what we saw to the authorities, but they found no trace of the camp or the man. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Marvin and I never spoke of it again, the memory too disturbing to revisit. As I sit here now, back in the comfort of my home, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something truly evil. The Grand Canyon holds many secrets, and some are better left undisturbed. My name is Levi Campbell, and I'm 25 years old. I'm a freelance journalist, and, to be honest, a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. This happened in October of last year when I decided to investigate Devil's Hollow, a place near Fort Wayne, Indiana, notorious for its ghost stories and rumors of occult rituals. What I experienced there still haunts me, and it's something I can't explain, at least not in the way I'd like to. I pulled my RV into Devil's Hollow just as the sun was beginning to set. The area lived up to its reputation. Fog rolled lazily across the ground, and the trees loomed over the narrow road like skeletal fingers. My plan was simple: spend a weekend camping in the area, collect notes and photos, and write a story debunking the local legends. I was sure the so-called haunted reputation was just small-town folklore blown out of proportion. The clearing I parked in was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of wildlife, just silence. Atmospheric, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I set up camp quickly, unfolding a chair by the fire pit and arranging my camera gear on the picnic table. The plan was to explore the woods tomorrow and see if I could find any of the symbols or signs mentioned in my research. The trouble started almost immediately. As I settled in, the lights in the RV began to flicker. I checked the generator. It was running fine, but the interior lights continued to pulse erratically, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Then my camera refused to charge despite being plugged into a fully functional power bank. "Great," I muttered. "Looks like this place is hard on electronics." The first real warning sign came the next morning. I woke early, brewed some coffee, and decided to take a short hike to familiarize myself with the area. I followed a faint trail that wound deeper into the woods, the fog clinging to my legs like damp sheets. About half a mile in, I noticed footprints on the path, barefoot, human-like, but disturbingly large. The prints were fresh, leading away from the trail into the trees. I stopped, staring at them for a long moment. The rational part of my brain told me it was just someone messing around, maybe a local trying to scare campers. Still, the unease in my gut grew stronger. It's just footprints, I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. I snapped a few pictures and moved on. Back at the campsite, I met Emily. She ran the small general store a few miles down the road and had stopped by to check on me, probably out of curiosity. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of caution. "You're camping out here alone?" she asked, leaning against her dusty pickup truck. "Yeah," I said, "just doing some research for a story." Emily frowned. "People don't usually stay here long. Devil's Hollow isn't welcoming to strangers." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "So I've heard, but I don't scare easy." "You should," she said flatly. "That place remembers everyone who stays too long. Be careful where you step." She hesitated before climbing back into her truck. "And don't go to the hollow itself. Some things are better left alone." Her words stayed with me long after she drove off. That night, things took a turn. As I sat by the fire, reviewing my notes, I heard movement in the woods. At first, it sounded like branches snapping underfoot, but then it became something else entirely, whispering. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, like multiple voices speaking at once. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they were too garbled to understand. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped instantly. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Finally, I shook it off and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The flickering lights had returned, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me, but when I opened my eyes, I saw something in the corner of the room. It was faint, almost like a trick of the light, but it looked like a human figure just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled for the flashlight on my nightstand. When I flicked it on, the figure was gone. The next morning, I found symbols carved into the trees around my campsite. They were crude and angular, like something you'd see in a horror movie. "Probably just vandals," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Desperate for answers, I reviewed the audio recordings I'd made during the night. At first, it was just static, but then I heard it. The whispers. They were clearer now, overlapping voices that repeated the same phrase over and over. When I reversed the audio, the words became clear. "The land is bound. Blood must free it." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to leave, but something about the message made me stay. I needed to understand what was happening. That evening, I ventured deeper into the woods, following a faint path that seemed to lead toward the heart of Devil's Hollow. The fog thickened as I walked, and the air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth. About a mile in, I found a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred with the same symbols I'd seen earlier. The ground beneath it was blackened, as if burned. As I approached, I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was pushing against me. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from every direction. I turned to leave, but froze when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the mist. They were humanoid but wrong, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The figures didn't move, but their eyes followed me. The pressure in my chest grew stronger, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. I ran back to the RV, my mind racing. What were those things, and what did the whispers mean? That night was the worst. The shadowy figures surrounded the RV, their glowing eyes peering through the windows. They pounded on the walls, shaking the entire vehicle. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Desperate, I grabbed a knife and carved one of the symbols from the trees into my palm, hoping it would do something. Blood dripped onto the floor as I shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The pounding stopped, the shadowy figures retreated, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard it, a voice, deep and guttural, coming from outside. The pact must be fulfilled. In a moment of desperation, I returned to the clearing with the oak tree. The shadowy figures were waiting for me, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. I knelt beneath the tree and pressed my bloody palm to its blackened roots. "Take it," I whispered. "Take what you want. Just let me go." The figures surrounded me, their whispers growing louder until it felt like my head would split. Then, as quickly as it started, everything went silent. The pressure in my chest lifted, and the figures dissolved into the mist. When I returned to the RV, the lights were steady, and the engine started on the first try. I left Devil's Hollow that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind, or that something had followed me. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to find symbols drawn on my walls or hear faint whispers coming from the shadows. I don't know what I unleashed in Devil's Hollow, but one thing is certain: I'll never go back. This is the kind of place that stays with you. Even if you escape, it finds a way to remind you it's still watching. When you're out RV camping, you think you're just going to relax, maybe catch some fish, grill up some dinner, and enjoy the peace and quiet away from the city. But sometimes things don't go as planned. I should have known when my old RV sputtered and died just 10 miles from the nearest town, but I managed to fix it. At least I thought I did. The campgrounds were nestled deep in the forest of the Pacific Northwest, miles away from the nearest human settlement. Perfect for a getaway, I thought. My name's Owen Marlowe, by the way, and I've always enjoyed the solitude that comes with the wilderness. I've dealt with my share of hardships, including a divorce that left me craving isolation. This trip was supposed to be a break from the chaos. I parked the RV at a secluded spot beside a tranquil lake surrounded by dense trees. The water was clear, reflecting the towering pines and the sky above. It was beautiful, serene, and entirely off the grid. I unpacked, set up a fire pit, and got ready to spend the day fishing. Around mid-afternoon, a guy wandered into my camp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his clothes looked like they hadn't seen a washer in a good while. His name was Elias Jarvis. Elias said he was hiking through the area and had lost his way. He seemed friendly enough, although a bit scruffy. I offered him some water and a sandwich, and we got to talking. Elias mentioned he was looking for a place called Devil's Gorge. The name alone should have been a red flag, but I figured it was just some local hiking spot with a dramatic name. He said he was a nature enthusiast, but the more we talked, the more I realized he knew less about the wilderness than he let on. His questions were off, like he was trying to learn more about me than the area. We shared a few beers, and before I knew it, the sun was setting. Elias said he'd camp nearby and find his way to Devil's Gorge in the morning. I nodded, and he wandered off into the trees. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just an oddball. That night, I woke up to a noise outside the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard whispers. I crept to the window and peeked out in the dim moonlight. I saw Elias talking to another man. This guy was shorter, stockier, with a shaved head and a thick beard. They were arguing, though I couldn't make out the words. I felt a chill run through me. Why would Elias lie about being lost? And who was this other guy? I decided to confront them. Grabbing my flashlight and the hunting knife I always kept by my bed, I stepped outside, quietly closing the door behind me. "Elias!" I called out, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What's going on here?" The two men froze, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then Elias turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Owen, meet my brother Gary. He found me after we got separated. Sorry if we woke you." Gary gave a nod, but his eyes were cold, assessing. Something was definitely off. "It's fine," I lied, "just making sure everything's okay." Elias and Gary exchanged a look before Elias said, "Yeah, we're good. Thanks for checking on us." I went back to the RV, but sleep was out of the question. I stayed up, knife in hand, listening for any sounds that might hint at trouble. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Maybe I was overreacting, I thought. The next morning, Elias and Gary were gone, their campsite showing no signs they had ever been there. I decided to pack up and leave, but as I walked around the RV to disconnect the water hookup, I noticed something strange. A small patch of earth near the back had been disturbed. Curious, I knelt down and brushed away the loose dirt. To my horror, I found a human finger, bloody and partially decomposed. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I had to call the authorities, but my cell phone had no signal out here. I scrambled back into the RV, started the engine, and prayed it would make it to town. Driving down the narrow, winding road, I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting Elias and Gary to pop out from behind a tree. When I finally reached the town, I headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Jackman was a no-nonsense type with a grizzled beard and a permanent scowl. I told him everything about Elias, Gary, the argument, and the finger I found. Jackman didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said grimly. "There have been a few hikers gone missing in those woods over the past year. We found traces, but nothing concrete until now." He assembled a team, and we headed back to the campsite. The sheriff's deputies scoured the area where I found the finger and soon uncovered more remains. It was clear this was the work of more than one person. As they expanded the search, they found a shallow grave with the body of a young woman, her face twisted in terror. The sheriff turned to me. "Looks like you stumbled onto something big, Marlowe. We need to find these bastards." The rest of the day was a blur of questioning and searching. They found more evidence, personal belongings, more bones, and signs of multiple campfires. Elias and Gary were using the remote areas as their hunting ground, preying on unsuspecting campers and hikers. As night fell, the mood grew tense. The sheriff's men were on high alert, scanning the forest with flashlights and keeping their weapons ready. I stayed close to the RV, feeling a mix of fear and anger. How could I have been so naive? Around midnight, a deputy found a trail of footprints leading deeper into the woods. We followed, the air thick with anticipation. The trail ended at an old abandoned cabin, half hidden by the undergrowth. The sheriff signaled for silence, and we approached cautiously. Inside, the cabin was a nightmare. Blood stains on the floor and makeshift restraints on the walls told a gruesome story. The stench of decay was overpowering. We moved through the rooms, checking for any signs of life. Then we heard it, a faint rustling from the back room. Guns drawn, we burst in, finding Elias and Gary huddled over a map, planning their next move. They looked up, shocked, and in that split second, I saw the madness in their eyes. "Drop the weapons," the sheriff yelled. But instead of complying, Elias lunged at us, a wild look on his face. Shots rang out, and he collapsed, clutching his chest. Gary tried to run, but he didn't get far. A deputy tackled him to the ground, cuffing him before he could react. Elias was dead, but Gary was alive, spitting curses and struggling against the deputies as they dragged him out. He glared at me. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You'll see." The authorities combed the area for more evidence and identified more victims from the belongings found in the cabin. It was clear that Elias and Gary had been at this for a while. The sheriff thanked me for coming forward and assured me that Gary would face justice. I left the campsite the next day, my mind reeling from the ordeal. It was over, but the images of what I'd seen would stay with me forever. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about the victims and their families. I hoped they would find some peace, knowing the killers had been caught. And as for me, I knew I'd never forget the time I went RV camping and uncovered a nightmare in the heart of the forest. My name is Alexander Wagner, and I'm 33 years old. I'm a wildlife biologist and an avid camper. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods to the chaos of city life. But what happened to me last October in Shade State Park changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. I wasn't just alone out there. I was being hunted. I'd just gone through a messy breakup and needed an escape. Shade State Park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and refocus on my work. I had an article deadline looming about the biodiversity in Indiana state parks, and I figured a few nights in the woods would give me the peace I needed to write. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV in one of the more secluded campsites near the edge of the park. The The spot was surrounded by tall trees, their leaves starting to turn shades of orange and gold. A narrow ravine cut through the area, and the soft gurgle of a distant creek was the only sound as I set up my gear. I realized I'd forgotten to pack extra batteries for my flashlight. Amateur mistake, I muttered to myself. Still, I shrugged it off, figuring my phone's light would suffice if needed. I was more concerned about the thick fog rolling in. It clung to the ground, making the woods feel unnervingly still. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it for the first time, faint crying drifting through the trees. It sounded like a child, soft and pitiful. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the woods, but this was different. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, like an instinct I couldn't ignore. "Hello?" I called, standing and shining my phone's light into the trees. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. My gut told me to stay put, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone might need help. Grabbing my phone and a jacket, I ventured a few steps into the woods. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice trembling. No answer, just the rustling of leaves as a light breeze picked up. After a few minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the RV, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The next morning, I met Ranger Neil. He was making his rounds and stopped by my campsite to chat. He was in his 40s with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You out here all alone?" "Yeah," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm a biologist doing some research." "Ah, well, be careful," he said, glancing at the fog still clinging to the trees. "Shade's got its quirks. Folks around here like to tell stories about the Crying Woods." I raised an eyebrow. "The Crying Woods?" "Old legend," he said, leaning on his truck. "Back in the 30s, a little girl went missing out here. Family never found her. Some say you can still hear her crying, trying to lead people into the woods. Thing is, those who follow the sound don't always come back." I laughed nervously. "That's unsettling." Neil gave me a long, serious look. "Just stay on the trails, all right?" I nodded, but his words stuck with me. That day, I decided to explore a few trails and take notes for my article. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, full of vibrant colors and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into my hike, I noticed footprints on the trail. They were small, like a child's, and barefoot. I stopped, frowning. What kind of parent lets their kid wander around here without shoes? The prints veered off the trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I crouched down to take a closer look. The edges of the prints were fresh, the soil still slightly damp. A chill ran down my spine. I stood quickly, deciding it was time to head back to the RV. That night, the crying returned. It started softly, just beyond the edge of the campsite. This time, it didn't stop when I called out. Instead, it grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," a small voice whimpered. My heart raced as I peered out the RV window. In the dim firelight, I saw her, a girl no older than 8, standing at the edge of the trees. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair tangled and wild. She was crying, her shoulders shaking. "Hey," I called, grabbing my jacket. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, and for a moment our eyes met. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, but her eyes, they were hollow, dark as the void. Before I could react, she turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I shouted, chasing after her. The fog swallowed me as I stumbled through the trees, calling for the girl. The crying grew fainter, pulling me deeper and deeper into the woods. My phone's light barely cut through the haze, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Finally, I stopped, gasping for breath. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I turned in a slow circle, realizing I had no idea where I was. My stomach sank. Then I saw it, a small, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the windows were broken. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity won out. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light as I stepped over broken furniture and shattered glass. On a table in the corner, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. My breath caught as I read the headline, "Local Girl Missing in Shade State Park." The date was from 1937. Beneath the article was a photograph of the girl. It was her, the same girl I'd seen in the woods. As I skimmed the article, a detail jumped out at me. The girl had been suspected of pushing her younger brother into a ravine shortly before her disappearance. She claimed it was an accident, but witnesses reported hearing the siblings arguing moments before the tragedy. A sudden sound made me whirl around. The crying had returned, louder now, echoing through the cabin. My hands shook as I backed toward the door. When I stepped outside, the girl was there, standing at the edge of the ravine. Her crying stopped as she turned to face me. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice laced with anger. "I didn't," I stammered, my throat dry. "I'm here to help." She took a step closer, and her face twisted. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Her eyes began to bleed, dark streaks running down her pale cheeks. "You'll stay with me," she said, her voice a distorted growl. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized too late that I was standing at the edge of the ravine. Roots and dirt crumbled under my feet as the girl lunged at me, her hands clawing at my arms. I screamed, swinging my phone at her. The light catching her face, she recoiled, hissing like an animal, and vanished into the fog. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the forest floor, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The walk was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. When I finally locked myself inside, I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my knees to my chest. As I drove out of the park the next morning, I heard the crying one last time, faint and distant. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the road, watching me leave. I haven't gone back to Shade State Park since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a child crying outside my window, and I know she's still waiting for me. This story highlights the chilling lure of a malevolent spirit preying on empathy and curiosity to trap its victims. I woke up that morning with a sense of unease. Something about the quiet was off. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart pound a little harder. My name's Gregory, and I'd driven out to the middle of nowhere in an RV hoping to get some peace and quiet. Life had been a series of endless loops, a carousel of monotony that I desperately needed to step off. The campsite was perfect, nestled in the thick woods of northern Michigan. It was isolated enough that you couldn't hear any traffic, just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. I had my chair set up by the fire pit, and the coffee was brewing on the small stove inside the RV. My routine started with a morning hike. The path I'd chosen was well-trodden but still wild, the kind where you could easily believe you were the first person to step foot there in years. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was fresh with that earthy smell that only a forest can have. I was about an hour into my hike when I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, but there was something oddly compelling about it. The door hung off its hinges, and the windows were shattered, giving it a skeletal look. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The inside of the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Old furniture was strewn about, and papers littered the floor. I bent down to pick up a yellowed piece of paper, which seemed to be a letter. It was hard to make out the faded ink, but the words "help" and "trapped" were unmistakable. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught my attention. It was a low rustling, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly stuffed the letter into my pocket. Stepping outside, I looked around but saw nothing. The forest was eerily quiet again. I decided it was time to head back to the RV. The uneasy feeling had returned, stronger than before. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sped up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my campsite. When I arrived, I found the RV door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously stepped inside. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the coffee pot was smashed on the floor and the contents of my backpack were scattered around. Someone had been here. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in the RV and stepped back outside, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were fixed on me with a disturbing intensity. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the knife tighter. He didn't respond, just stood there staring. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Who the hell was this guy, and what did he want? I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my escape from reality. I decided to follow him, keeping my distance, but staying close enough to keep him in sight. The man moved quickly through the forest, almost as if he knew it, like the back of his hand. I struggled to keep up, branches slapping against my face and thorns scratching my arms. After what felt like hours, we arrived at another clearing, this one dominated by a large, ominous-looking structure. It was an old warehouse, abandoned and overgrown with ivy. The man slipped inside through a broken window, and I cautiously followed. The interior of the warehouse was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him again, standing at the far end of the room. "Why are you following me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I should be asking you the same thing," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What do you want from me?" He let out a low, humorless laugh. "You shouldn't have come here. This place isn't for people like you." I felt a surge of defiance. "And what exactly is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the warehouse. I hesitated for a moment before following him. We navigated through a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. Finally, we arrived at a large open space that seemed to be some sort of makeshift living quarters. There were makeshift beds, old furniture, and even a small stove. "Welcome to my home," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "I've been living here for years." "Ever since I disappeared," he added. "Disappeared?" I asked, confused. "Yeah, disappeared, like all those people you read about in the papers. Just vanished without a trace. Only I didn't vanish. I chose to live off the grid, away from society." I started to piece it together. This guy was one of those missing persons you hear about on the news, the ones who vanish and are never found. But he had chosen this life for reasons I couldn't understand. "Why?" I asked. "Why live like this?" He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Because society is broken. People are selfish, cruel, and deceitful. Out here, I'm free. I don't have to answer to anyone." "But you're not free," I argued. "You're trapped here, just like that letter said." His eyes flashed with anger. "You read the letter?" "Yeah, I did. Someone was asking for help." "Who was it?" He laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. "That was me, a long time ago. I thought I wanted to be found, but then I realized I was better off alone." I felt a chill run through me. This guy was clearly unhinged. I needed to get out of there, and fast. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just go, and we can both pretend this never happened." He shook his head. "I can't let you do that. You know too much." Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the knife out of my hand. We struggled, rolling across the dirty floor. He was stronger than he looked, and I was quickly overpowered. He pinned me down, his hand closing around my throat. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur. In a desperate move, I reached for a nearby piece of broken glass and slashed at his arm. He screamed in pain and released his grip. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife and running for the exit. I could hear him behind me, cursing and stumbling. I burst out of the warehouse and into the forest, running as fast as I could. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I broke through the trees and into the clearing where my RV was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. There's a man. He's trying to kill me, I gasped. Stay calm, sir. Where are you? I gave them my location, praying they would get here in time. I could hear the man outside banging on the door and shouting. I grabbed the hunting rifle I kept in the RV, loading it with trembling hands. The banging stopped and everything went silent. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers quickly surrounded the RV, weapons drawn. I opened the door, hands raised, and they rushed in, securing the area. They found the man a short distance away, bleeding and delirious. He was taken into custody and later identified as Leonard Bain, a man who had been missing for over a decade. The police found evidence of his crimes in the warehouse, the remains of several missing persons who had met a gruesome end at his hands. The story made headlines, and I was hailed as a hero for helping to bring him to justice. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest, which had once been a place of solace, now felt like a place of nightmares. I knew I'd never come back here, but I couldn't forget what happened. Leonard Bain had chosen his isolation, but it had driven him to madness, and I had stumbled into his dark world by chance. The authorities cleaned up the site, and the remains were identified and returned to their families. Life went on, but I was forever changed by that encounter. The scars on my neck were a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death. In the end, I realized that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't hiding in the dark. They're right there in plain sight, wearing the face of a man who just wanted to be left alone. And sometimes the only way to survive is to fight back, no matter how terrifying the odds. My name is Lila Carter, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a middle school teacher from Indiana. This happened in May of last year during a solo camping trip at Potato Creek State Park. At the time, I thought I just needed a weekend away, some time to decompress after the chaos of the school year. But what I found out there wasn't peace. It was something I don't think I'll ever truly escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, late enough that the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. Potato Creek is beautiful, with wide open lakes and dense forest trails that seem to stretch forever. I parked my old RV at the site near the water and set up my little camp. A folding chair by the fire pit, my journal, and pens on the picnic table. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. The first issue popped up almost immediately. The generator on my RV wouldn't stay on for more than a few minutes before sputtering out. I cursed under my breath. Without it, I wouldn't have power for lights or to charge my phone. I reminded myself I'd come here to unplug anyway and shrugged it off. As I was unpacking, I noticed something odd. A deer stood at the edge of the woods, staring directly at me. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the way it stood there, perfectly still like a statue, sent a ripple of unease through me. When I waved my arms to scare it off, it didn't flinch. It just turned its head slightly as if trying to understand me, then disappeared into the trees. I tried not to think about it as I made dinner. Night fell quickly, bringing a heavy silence with it. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, and that's when I heard that whistling. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried by the breeze. I assumed it was another camper, but when I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from the nearby sites. It was coming from deep in the woods. I don't know why, but the sound unsettled me. I went inside the RV and locked the door. When I checked my phone, I saw that I had no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were strange that night. I kept hearing someone whispering my name over and over. When I finally woke up, Drenched in sweat, I realized the RV door was slightly ajar. My heart nearly stopped. I was certain I'd locked it before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and go for a hike. The fresh air felt good, and I started to relax as I walked the trails. That's when I saw the footprints. They were barefoot, large, but with long, twisted toes, almost like claws. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They appeared out of nowhere in the dirt and led off the trail into the dense underbrush. I stood there, staring at them, my gut telling me to turn back, but I shook it off. It's just some weird animal, I told myself. Probably a bear. When I got back to my campsite, I met Jaden. He was camping a few sites down and seemed about my age, mid-30s, with a friendly smile and a bit of a nosy streak. "You camping alone?" he asked, glancing at my RV. I nodded and he raised an eyebrow. "You're braver than me. This place has a weird vibe, you know?" I laughed nervously and tried to brush him off, but he kept talking. "You heard the stories about this area? The Skinwalker legend?" I shook my head, even though the word sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before somewhere, but I couldn't remember the details. "It's an old Native American story," Jaden explained. "They say it's a shapeshifter, a spirit that can take the form of anything it wants. People, animals. It mimics voices, tries to lure you into the woods. Once you see it, you're pretty much screwed." He grinned, like it was all a big joke, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Thanks for the bedtime story," I said dryly, trying to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the knot forming in my stomach. That night, I heard the whistling again, louder this time. It started faint, like the night before, but it grew closer and closer until it sounded like it was right outside the RV. Then it stopped, replaced by silence. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lila," a voice called softly. My blood turned to ice. It was my voice. "Lila," it said again, this time with a strange rasping tone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a flashlight, and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like me, but wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing. No, I whispered, barely able to breathe. The thing outside started scratching at the RV door, slow and deliberate, the sound making my skin crawl. "Lila, let me in," it said, still using my voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner of the RV, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I dared to open the door. There were long claw marks running down the side of the RV, and my campsite was in disarray. Chairs knocked over, food scattered everywhere. Jaden's campsite was silent. When I went to check on him, his tent was slashed open, and his belongings were strewn about like mine. A dark stain, blood, I realized, marked the ground near the fire pit. I called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic set in. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I needed to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The thing had done something to it. I was sure of it. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, I heard Jaden's voice calling from the woods. "Lila, over here. I need help." It sounded desperate, terrified. "Jaden?" I called back, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" "Just a little further," his voice replied. I froze. Something about the tone wasn't right. It was too flat, too monotone, and then I remembered what Jaden had said about the Skinwalker mimicking voices. My blood ran cold. "I'm not falling for it," I muttered, backing away from the tree line. That's when I saw it. The thing stepped out from the woods. Its body hunched and twisted. It shifted forms right in front of me, going from Jaden to me to something else entirely, something grotesque with long-clawed fingers and glowing yellow eyes. It let out a guttural, inhuman screech and started toward me. I ran back into the RV and slammed the door shut just as the creature reached it. It pounded on the sides, the force shaking the whole vehicle. I grabbed a bag of salt from the cupboard. I remembered hearing somewhere that salt could ward off evil spirits, and poured a circle around myself. The pounding stopped. The creature's face appeared at the window, grinning at me with razor-sharp teeth. It snarled, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "You can't hide forever, Lila," it hissed, its voice a sickening mixture of mine and Jaden's. "I'll see you soon." It disappeared as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. I stayed in that circle until I was sure it was gone. When I finally dared to step outside, I saw that the creature had carved something into the hood of the RV. "You can't run." I left Potato Creek that morning, abandoning the RV and walking to the nearest ranger station to call for help. They found Jaden's body 2 days later, deep in the woods. His injuries were so horrific that they wouldn't tell me the details. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if I ever will, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whistling outside my window, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me. My name is Wesley Crane. It's 2015, and I'm sitting in an RV park just outside Yellowstone, wondering how the hell I got here. I'm not really the outdoorsy type, to be honest, but after my divorce last year, I thought it'd be good for me to get away from everything. Clear my head, do the whole finding myself thing. I bought an old RV, thinking I'd hit the open road and maybe grow some stubble while pretending to know what I'm doing. I work as an accountant, so my idea of adventure usually involves tax loopholes, not whatever I just went through. To set the stage, I'm parked at this quiet little site, nothing but me, some trees, and the occasional squirrel to keep me company. The park is gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but there's something unnerving about how isolated it feels. You don't realize how much noise there is in a city until you're somewhere like this, where the silence itself is almost loud. I had been camping out for a couple of days already, pretending to enjoy my lukewarms of beans and the lack of decent Wi-Fi when I decided to venture out a little farther than usual. There's this trail that winds up through the woods just past where I parked. A real postcard kind of place. I figured I'd hike for an hour or two, then come back, maybe crack open a beer and convince myself I was becoming a nature guy. The first part of the walk was fine, quiet, peaceful even. There wasn't a soul in sight, which I thought was kind of weird for the height of tourist season, but I figured everyone else had more sense than to hike alone. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe a film set I'd accidentally wandered into. There was an RV, not unlike mine, tucked into a small clearing just off the path, but it was trashed. Not like Bear Attack trashed, but methodical, almost surgical. Doors hanging off, windows smashed, the roof torn out in places. It didn't look like the kind of damage nature could do. No, this was something more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to check it out. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. It wasn't just the damage, it was the atmosphere. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My stomach churned with the kind of unease you can't quite put into words, like you've just remembered something horrible you'd tried to forget. I stopped short of the RV's door, realizing I didn't want to see inside, but by then I'd already seen too much. There was blood. Splashes of it across the side of the vehicle, like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint at it. And there was more, drag marks leading from the RV into the woods. It didn't take a genius to know something bad had happened here. I should have turned back right then, sprinted down that trail, and never looked back. But no, like an idiot, I stepped closer. Inside, the place was torn apart, furniture overturned, dishes shattered on the floor, personal belongings scattered everywhere. It was like someone had been living there 1 second, and then suddenly, wasn't. The worst part, though, wasn't the blood or the destruction. It was the suitcase. A half-packed suitcase sitting on the bed as if someone had been about to leave but never got the chance. I'm not sure how long I stood there just staring at it, my brain trying to catch up with what I was seeing. Long enough, apparently, for the owner of the RV to come back. It was a sound. A twig snapping behind me that jolted me out of my stupor. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped over myself, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, but that wasn't what set off the alarm bells in my head. It was the look on his face, a kind of calm that didn't belong in a scene like this. He wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, it felt like he'd been expecting me. He stepped closer, too close for comfort, and my mouth went dry. He had this casual way about him, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't worried about consequences. His clothes were dirty, but not in the "I've been camping" way. More like, "I've been living out here, away from the law" kind of dirty. "You lost?" His voice was quiet, controlled, not threatening, but definitely not friendly either. I stammered out some excuse about getting off the trail, how I didn't mean to intrude, but the way he looked at me, it was like he could see right through the lies. He glanced at the RV, then back at me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I'll tell you this, people talk about fight or flight, but there's a third option they don't always mention: freeze. And that's exactly what I did, like a deer in headlights, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then he smiled, and that's when I knew I was screwed. I don't remember much about what happened next. One second, he was a few feet away, and the next he was on me, hands around my neck, squeezing. I don't even think he was trying to kill me. Not yet, just testing me, like a cat plays with a mouse. I thrashed, managed to elbow him in the ribs, and for a second, his grip loosened just enough for me to get away. I ran blindly, stupidly, crashing through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy but unhurried, like he knew the woods better than I ever could. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks tripping me up, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. Eventually, I burst back onto the main trail, my lungs on fire, legs shaking like jelly. I half collapsed behind a boulder, trying to quiet my breathing, praying he hadn't followed, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in that spot, waiting. Time felt strange, stretched out, like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare loop, but he never came. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I bolted back to the RV park, not stopping until I slammed the door of my camper shut behind me. For the next few hours, I sat in silence, too scared to even peek out the windows. But nothing happened. No knocks on the door, no shadowy figure lurking in the trees, just the oppressive weight of everything I'd seen. I don't know why I didn't call the cops right then and there. Maybe part of me didn't believe it really happened, or maybe I was just too damn scared. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the RV made me jump. Every gust of wind had me convinced he was out there, waiting for me to slip up. The next morning, I packed up and left, driving as far and as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not once. A few days later, after I'd put some distance between me and Yellowstone, curiosity got the better of me. I did some digging. Turns out, the guy I ran into had a name: Harvey Dunn, former Marine, dishonorably discharged for reasons that were never made public. He'd gone off the grid about 5 years ago, and there were rumors, ugly ones, about people who'd crossed his path and never been seen again. Authorities had been looking for him, but he was like a ghost, popping up in random places, always just out of reach. The RV I found? It belonged to a couple from Ohio. Their bodies were discovered 2 weeks later, buried not far from where I'd been. So yeah, I got lucky. Real lucky. But Harvey's still out there, and I've got a feeling our paths will cross again. Maybe next time I won't be so lucky. My name is Nicholas Harris, and I'm 57 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, just after I retired as a forest ranger. I had spent over 30 years in the wilderness patrolling trails, chasing off bears, and sometimes even helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. You'd think a man like me would have no reason to be afraid of the woods, but I'm telling you what I experienced in the Hoare National Forest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I had just bought an old RV, a 1988 Winnebago. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The plan was simple: park it somewhere secluded, spend a few days camping, and finally get the peace I had been craving. My wife, Catherine, used to love trips like this. She passed 5 years ago in a hiking accident, one I couldn't prevent, and I still carry the guilt of it. I thought this trip might help me reconnect with her memory and maybe even forgive myself. I chose the Sycamore Trail in Hoare National Forest. It's not as busy as some of the other spots, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. The locals had always told stories about the area, warnings to stay away from certain trails, whispers of things that didn't belong in those woods. But I'd always chalked it up to superstition. After all, the forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. The first day went smoothly enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing just off the trailhead. It was a gorgeous spot, the kind of place Catherine would have loved. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the trees were blazed with autumn colors. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked myself a simple meal of canned chili. The only problem was my equipment. My old flashlight was flickering, and my camp stove gave me trouble lighting up. Nothing major, just annoyances, or so I thought. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. Just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to head inside the RV, I heard something. Nicholas. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like Catherine. Nicholas, help me. The voice was coming from deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart was racing. I told myself it couldn't be her. It couldn't. But it sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. I didn't go far. My flashlight barely worked, and the further I moved from the fire, the darker and colder it got. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the mud. They were strange, like a mix between human footprints and animal paw prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot but with claws. They led in a wide circle around my RV before disappearing into the woods. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. Nicholas, please, it hurts. It was Catherine, or at least it sounded like her. Who's there? I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound tough. The forest didn't answer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering, and retreated to the safety of the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bird mimicking her voice, maybe I was hearing things, but deep down I knew better. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning exploring the trail, hoping a good hike would clear my head. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when the rain started. Light at first, then heavy. I sprained my ankle slipping on the wet ground while fetching firewood, cursing under my breath as I hobbled back to the RV. The storm made the forest even darker, and the flickering flashlight wasn't much help. That night, I heard scratching. It started faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was outside. I peered through the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my hunting rifle and edged toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the night. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest outline of a figure in the trees, tall and impossibly thin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood only to find deep scratches gouged into the metal, like claw marks. My chest tightened. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike out, sprained ankle or not. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, the air thick, oppressive. Every step I took felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. At first it looked human, long limbs, pale skin. But as I stepped closer, its head jerked unnaturally, and its body twisted, bending in ways no human body should. It turned toward me, and I swear it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Nicholas, back," it said in Catherine's voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the old fire tower, I climbed up, hoping the height would give me an advantage. The creature followed. It circled the base of the tower, its voice shifting between Catherine's pleas and a low guttural growl. "Nicholas, don't leave me," it whispered, its voice distorted and mocking. I remembered the stories, the ones I used to laugh at, skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic voices, take on forms, and lure people to their deaths. The locals had always said salt could repel them. It was worth a shot. I dug into my pack and poured a ring of salt around the platform, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature climbed halfway up the tower, but as it neared the salt, it recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. It stared at me for a long moment, its dark eyes burning with rage, before it slithered back down the ladder and disappeared into the woods. When the sun rose, I climbed down the tower, my legs trembling. The forest felt lighter, less oppressive, but the tracks in the mud told me the creature was still out there. I hobbled back to the RV, praying the engine would start. This time, it did. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I haven't been back to the Hoare National Forest since. I sold the RV, gave up camping, and tried to move on. But at night, I still hear Catherine's voice calling to me from the darkness, and I'll never forget those eyes. My name is Michael Lopez, and I'm 25 years old. This happened in October of last year when my best friend Sophia and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Dogwood Lake, deep in the heart of southern Indiana. I'll never forget those days, no matter how hard I try. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Sophia and I couldn't have been more different. She was bold, impulsive, and always looking for her next adventure. I, on the other hand, preferred plans, structure, and knowing exactly what I was walking into. But she had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I usually ended up having a good time. Usually, we'd rented an old RV for the trip, a boxy white thing with a sputtering engine that smelled faintly of mildew. I'd suggested staying in a cabin, but Sophia insisted the RV would be more authentic. After some back and forth, I gave in, as I always did. Besides, I was desperate for a break. My teaching job had been wearing me down, and Sophia's promise of crisp autumn air, hiking trails, and kayaking sounded like the reset I needed. We arrived at Dogwood Recreation Area in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The forest was alive with color, fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that reflected off the still surface of the lake. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and a touch of nerves. Sophia, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and started snapping photos the moment we parked. "Look at this light," she gushed. "It's perfect." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. That was Sophia, always chasing the perfect shot. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. There was a well-marked trailhead nearby, but Sophia had other ideas. She'd spotted a faint path leading off into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. "Let's check it out," she said, already heading in that direction. "Are you serious? It's getting dark," I protested. "That's the best time for photos," she called over her shoulder. "Come on, Michael, don't be such a buzzkill." Reluctantly, I followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting through dense trees that blocked out what little sunlight remained. I kept tripping over roots and brushing cobwebs from my face, muttering under my breath about poison ivy and ticks. Sophia, meanwhile, was in her element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Then she found it. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, something shiny poking out of the dirt. But when Sophia bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a locket, an old one, tarnished and rusted, but still intact. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Can you believe this? It's so vintage." "It's gross," I said. "Put it back." But she ignored me, rubbing the locket clean on her sleeve. "It's got initials engraved on it. I wonder who it belonged to." "Does it matter? It's trash." She shot me a look. "It's not trash, it's history." Then she slipped the locket into her pocket. "I'm keeping it." I didn't argue. What was the point? Sophia was stubborn, and once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. That night, things started to feel strange. The heater in the RV wouldn't work, so we huddled under blankets, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there watching us. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she laughed it off. "You're just spooked because it's so quiet out here," she said. "City girl problems." Maybe she was right. I told myself I was imagining things, and eventually drifted off to sleep. Then the dreams started. I was standing by the lake, staring at the water. A woman stood on the shore, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a dress that clung to her as if it were soaked. She was holding something, a locket, I realized. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, but no sound came out. When she turned around, her face was a mask of rage, her eyes hollow and black. She opened her mouth to scream, and I woke up gasping for air. Across the RV, Sophia was sound asleep, the locket clutched in her hand. The next day, Sophia acted normal, but I couldn't shake the dream. I told her about it over breakfast, expecting her to laugh it off again. Instead, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "I had a dream too about a woman at the lake." "What did she do?" "She was just standing there, watching me," she shrugged. "It didn't feel scary though, just sad." I wasn't convinced. Something about the locket wasn't right, but Sophia refused to get rid of it. "It's just a coincidence," she said. "Don't freak out." But as the day went on, the unease grew. Wet footprints appeared on the RV floor, even though neither of us had been near the water. Items went missing, a flashlight, Sophia's phone charger, only to turn up later in odd places. And then there were the voices. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Sophia heard it too. "Probably just echoes from another campsite," she said, though her tone was less certain. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. We stared into the darkness, but the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sophia's bed was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows under the sliver of moonlight. I found Sophia standing at the edge of the lake, her feet submerged in the water. She was holding the locket, her lips moving as if she were whispering something, though I couldn't hear the words. "Sophia!" I yelled. She turned slowly, her eyes glazed over. "She wants me to stay," she said, her voice distant and hollow. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the RV, but she fought me, her strength unnaturally strong. "Let go. I need to go to her." Finally, I managed to drag her inside and lock the door. She collapsed onto her bed and fell into a deep sleep, but I stayed awake, clutching a knife and listening for the sound of footsteps outside. The next morning, Sophia didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The locket's influence was growing stronger, and I knew we had to leave. But the RV wouldn't start. Sophia tried to call for help, but her phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged the night before. I suggested walking back to the main road, but she refused. "I'm not leaving the RV," she said. "What if someone comes by?" I didn't argue. I couldn't leave her alone, not when she was acting so strange. Instead, I decided to confront the problem head-on. That afternoon, while Sophia was napping, I took the locket and walked to the lake. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I stood at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my hand. "I know you're here," I said. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the lake rippled. and the woman appeared. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and rage. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Return it," she hissed, her voice like nails on glass. "Return what you stole." I threw the locket into the water and turned to run, but the children's laughter erupted around me, and I felt icy hands grab my ankles. I screamed, kicking and clawing, but the hands dragged me toward the water. Just as I thought I was going to drown, Sophia appeared, her face twisted with fear and determination. She held a stick lit with fire from the RV's stove. "Let her go," she screamed, thrusting the flame toward the water. The ghostly figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air. Sophia grabbed my arm and pulled me back to shore. Together, we watched as the locket sank beneath the surface, the ripples fading into stillness. We left Dogwood Lake the next day, abandoning the RV and hitchhiking back to civilization. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I knew we'd both been changed. Sophia never picked up her camera again, and I can't look at a lake without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some nights, I still hear the laughter, soft and distant, like an echo from a nightmare. I pray it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know it's not. My name is Camila Adams. I'm 22 years old, and this happened to me last November. It started as a camping trip in Brown County State Park, Indiana. Just a fun, challenging escape with friends. But what I experienced out there wasn't just nature. Something ancient and evil stalked us through that forest, and I barely made it out alive. It was Mason's idea. He was the ringleader in our group of 3, confident, outdoorsy, and just reckless enough to convince us this trip was a good idea. He was 26, with that charming, cocky smile that somehow made me trust him even when I shouldn't. Then there was Ben, Mason's best friend since childhood. He was 25, and the opposite of Mason, reserved, practical, and constantly trying to keep us from getting into trouble. Me? I was just there for the adventure. I'd been feeling stuck lately, living the same routine in Indianapolis, and Mason's enthusiasm made me want to break out of my comfort zone. So when he suggested we tackle an unofficial trail he'd found on some wilderness forum, I thought, why not? We packed light. Mason insisted we didn't need much for a 3-day trip. Looking back, that was mistake number 1. The first day went fine. We parked at the trailhead and hiked deeper into the park than I'd ever been. The colors of the late autumn forest were stunning, rich reds and golds under a steel gray sky. Mason led the way with his usual bravado, joking about how we didn't even need a map because he had the route all figured out. Ben kept muttering about how we should at least double-check our bearings, but Mason brushed him off. By the time we reached our first campsite, we were tired, but in good spirits. We set up a small fire, ate some protein bars, and talked about everything and nothing under the canopy of stars. It was peaceful until the forest went silent. I didn't notice it at first, but Ben did. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Mason replied, poking at the fire. "Nothing," Ben said. "No crickets, no owls, nothing." Now that he mentioned it, the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on us like a weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason shrugged it off, saying it was probably the cold weather, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The second day was harder. The hidden path Mason had raved about turned out to be more of a rough deer trail, barely visible under the thick leaves. My legs ached from climbing over fallen trees and trudging through uneven ground. To make matters worse, Ben's compass stopped working. He swore it had been fine yesterday, but now the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was messing with us. Around midday, we found something strange. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a massive oak tree. They were too high up to be from a bear, if there were even bears in this part of Indiana. Mason joked about Bigfoot, but Ben's face darkened. "This isn't right," Ben said. "We should turn back." "Turn back? Come on, man, we're fine," Mason said. "Don't wimp out now." Ben shot me a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I wanted to agree with him, but I didn't want to be the one to back down first. So we kept going. That night, the hunger started. Mason devoured most of our food. He claimed he hadn't eaten enough earlier and needed the energy, but the way he tore through the rations was unsettling. His hands shook as he unwrapped granola bars, and his eyes had this wild, hollow look. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just starving," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Don't worry about it." Ben pulled me aside while Mason stomped off to gather more firewood. "Something's wrong with him," Ben whispered. "He's acting off." "I know," I said. "But what are we supposed to do? Drag him back to the car?" Ben didn't answer. He just stared into the dark woods, his jaw tight. Later that night, I heard whispering. I'd stepped away from the campfire to use the bathroom. The air was freezing, my breath puffing white in front of me. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy murmur just beyond the tree line. "Ben? Mason?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, too far away to be either of them. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Mason asked when he saw me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I heard them." "It's probably just the wind," Mason said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben pulled out the flimsy flashlight Camila had packed, the beam flickering weakly as he scanned the surrounding trees. "We need to leave first thing in the morning," he said. Morning didn't come fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Mason vomiting behind the tent. When I went to check on him, I saw blood mixed in with the bile. "You're sick," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get you out of here." "No," Mason rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Ben snapped. "You look like death, and now we're out of food, thanks to you." Mason glared at him, his teeth bared. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at Ben, but then he stumbled back, clutching his stomach. "Let's just keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. We packed up and started hiking, but Mason was slower now, his breath labored. The trail seemed to twist in on itself, leading us deeper into the forest instead of out. The claw marks appeared more frequently, gouged into the trees like some kind of territorial warning. And then we found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like spears, the flesh stripped away as if something had gnawed on it. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat and coppery blood. Mason stared at it for a long time, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, grabbing my arm. That night, Mason disappeared. Ben and I woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots gone. "We have to find him," I said, but Ben shook his head. "He's gone, Camila. We can't save him." "We can't just leave him out there," I yelled. Ben sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Fine, but if we don't find him by sunset, we're heading back." We followed a faint trail of footprints, half expecting to find Mason sitting by a tree, laughing about some stupid prank. Instead, we found him crouched over another deer carcass, his face smeared with blood. "Mason?" I called out softly. He turned to look at us, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunk, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones, his lips pulled back in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's inside me." Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, but Mason, or whatever he'd become, was fast. I could hear him behind us, his ragged breathing growing louder, closer. "Go!" Ben shouted, shoving me forward. "I'll hold him off." "No!" I screamed, but Ben didn't stop. He turned to face Mason, wielding a large branch like a spear. I didn't see what happened next. I just kept running, tears streaming down my face as I heard Ben's screams echoing through the trees. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bloodied and half frozen. Park rangers found me near the trailhead and took me to a hospital. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mason and Ben probably got lost and that I was lucky to make it out alive. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those woods, the Wendigo still roams, hungry and waiting for its next victim. My name's Samuel Neven, and back in 2004, I was working as a search and rescue officer in the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. I didn't grow up around here, though. I came from Indiana, a flat, uneventful place where the most excitement you'd get was a speeding ticket. The move to Kentucky was supposed to bring some adventure, and let me tell you, I got more than I bargained for. When I first got into this line of work, people said it was mainly about finding lost hikers or kids who wandered off the trails. They didn't warn me about the other things in the woods, the things you can't categorize. You see, I wasn't exactly what you'd call an experienced outdoorsman before I took this job. The closest I got to wildlife was grilling burgers in my backyard. But the forest grew on me. It felt like freedom. That was until the day it stopped feeling safe. It was mid-afternoon when the call came in. 2 campers, both young men, had gone missing near Red River Gorge. They had set out the previous morning and hadn't checked back with their friends. That wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. People lose track of time out here all the time. But something about the tone of the call had me on edge. Their friends said they weren't the type to just disappear without a trace. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner, Carl, an older guy who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. He had that look of someone who'd seen it all, but didn't say much about it. As we drove out to the trailhead, Carl kept tapping the wheel like he had something on his mind. Finally, he said, "You ever hear about that thing up in the gorge?" I glanced at him. "What thing?" He didn't answer right away. "Never mind," he muttered. "Just some stories the locals like to tell to scare tourists." We pulled up to the trailhead where we met the friends of the 2 missing campers. They were all rattled, wide-eyed, and shuffling nervously like something bad had already happened. One of them, a guy with a red bandana wrapped around his head, said they had been hiking together when the 2 missing guys went ahead, wanting to explore a cave they'd found. The rest of the group stayed back, and when their friends didn't return by nightfall, they started worrying. Carl, never one for comforting words, just grunted and motioned for me to follow him. We set out on the trail, winding through dense trees and jagged cliffs. The forest was quiet, too quiet. You start to notice these things when you've been out here long enough. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind and our footsteps crunching on the dirt. "Shouldn't there be, some wildlife or something?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Carl didn't respond, just picked up the pace, which wasn't exactly reassuring. About an hour in, we found the campsite the missing campers had set up. Tents were there, unzipped, sleeping bags tossed around like they'd left in a hurry. A couple of backpacks were strewn across the ground. What was strange, though, was that there were no signs of a struggle, just an eerie sense of abandonment. I crouched down near one of the backpacks, rifling through it for clues. Inside, I found the usual camping gear, but then I pulled out something odd, a torn piece of fur. It was coarse, thicker than anything I'd seen on a bear or deer. I showed it to Carl, but he just shrugged it off, mumbling something about wild animals. As we moved further into the forest, the trees began to close in around us, their twisted limbs casting distorted shadows on the ground. I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, nothing was there. About half a mile later, we came across something that made my blood run cold. One of the missing campers was slumped against a tree, his body mangled beyond recognition. His torso was torn open, jagged cuts running along his chest and arms, as if something had sliced him up with claws or teeth. There was no blood on the ground, though, which made it even more unsettling. Whatever did this didn't just kill him, it took its time. I staggered back, feeling bile rise in my throat. Carl knelt down to examine the body, his face grim but not surprised. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No kidding," I whispered. "What could have done this?" Carl stood up slowly, scanning the area. "Not sure, but we need to find the other one." The other one, right. There were 2. I had almost forgotten. My mind was still reeling from the sight in front of me. But we had a job to do. We pressed on, following a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed underbrush. It was getting darker, but we couldn't turn back now. About an hour later, we found the second camper. or at least what was left of him. His body was hanging from a tree, suspended by a mess of vines and branches. It looked like he'd been lifted up and shredded apart, his limbs dangling at odd angles. I could barely breathe at this point. It was like we had stumbled into some twisted hunting ground. "We should call this in," I said, my voice shaking. Carl didn't move. He was staring at something off to the side, just beyond the body. "Look!" I followed his gaze and saw it. Movement in the trees. Something was crouching low, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was huge, larger than anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was covered in matted fur, like that of a wild boar, but its movements were more feline, smooth and predatory. The creature's head was elongated, almost like a wolf's, but it had this strange, twisted quality to it, as if nature had gone wrong somewhere. It stood there for a moment, staring at us, before letting out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in my chest. Carl grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my daze. "Run?" I always figured if anything bad ever happened to me, it would be out on the open road, miles away from anyone who could help. Maybe that's why I started carrying a gun. I never wanted to feel helpless. Not that I've had to use it before, but it's there, tucked under the seat of my rig, just in case. The highway was quieter than usual that night, and I was heading west, cutting through some remote stretch of Wyoming. The air was crisp, a bite of winter hanging on, even though it should have been warmer by now. I had a load of lumber bound for some construction site in Idaho. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mind was on the job. The kind of solitary thinking that comes when you're hours into a long haul. It wasn't until I hit the small, nearly forgotten town of Pine Ridge that things started to feel off. Not that there was much to the place. A single gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't served a hot meal in years, and a couple of houses with their windows boarded up. I needed to refuel, so I pulled into the gas station, the only sign of life in the whole town. The pump was ancient, the kind where you have to flip the lever to start the gas flowing. As I filled up, I noticed the attendant inside the station, a wiry man with a weathered face. He was watching me, his eyes never leaving me. I gave him a nod, more out of habit than friendliness, but he didn't respond, just kept staring like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to small-town suspicion. Strangers don't exactly roll through Pine Ridge every day. I paid for the gas and got back in the truck, eager to put some miles between me and that town. As I pulled out, I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the road. I hadn't seen it when I pulled in, but then again, I wasn't paying much attention. The thing looked like it hadn't run in years, rust eating away at the body and the tires flat against the pavement. An hour later, the road was deserted, just a ribbon of black cutting through the wilderness. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror. At first, it was just a faint glow, but they got closer. Fast. Too fast. My heart picked up, and I checked my speed. Maybe I was going too slow, but no, I was doing the limit. The lights got brighter, and I could make out the outline of the vehicle behind me. It was that old pickup from Pine Ridge, the same rusted hulk that looked like it shouldn't even be on the road. I kept my eyes on the mirror, expecting the truck to pass me by, but it didn't. Instead, it rode my tail, the headlights nearly blinding me. I tapped the brakes, a warning, but the pickup didn't back off. If anything, it got closer. Something wasn't right. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the pickup matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. The road ahead was nothing but darkness, and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached under the seat, feeling for the cold metal of the gun. My hand gripped the handle, but I didn't pull it out, not yet. There was a turn up ahead, a sharp one. I could lose him there, maybe. I flicked on my blinker, even though there was no one else around to see it, and took the turn hard. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The road curved through a dense patch of trees, and I couldn't see the headlights anymore. But then they reappeared, brighter than before, as the pickup tore around the bend, nearly clipping the back of my rig. Panic set in, and I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck faster than I'd ever dared before. The pickup stayed with me, relentless. I couldn't shake him. And then, like something out of a nightmare, he started ramming me. The first hit jolted me so hard I almost lost control. My trailer fishtailed, the weight of the lumber threatening to tip the whole reg over. I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to keep us on the road. Another hit, harder this time, and I knew I had to do something, or he'd run me off the road completely. I glanced at the gun still under the seat, but the thought of using it while driving terrified me. Instead, I scanned the road ahead, looking for anything that might help. Up ahead, I saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the right. It wasn't on my map, and I had no idea where it led, but it was my only option. I cut the wheel hard, veering off the main road onto the dirt path. The rig shuddered as the tires hit the rough ground, and I prayed the trailer wouldn't flip. The pickup followed right on my tail, its headlights bouncing in the darkness. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and lined with thick trees on either side. I could hear the pickup's engine roaring behind me, getting closer and closer. My mind raced with desperate ideas, none of them good. I could try to lose him in the trees, but one wrong move, and I'd be wrapped around a trunk. And then, out of nowhere, the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the dirt, and the rig came to a stop just inches from a steep drop-off. The pickup didn't stop. It rammed into the back of my trailer with a sickening crunch, and I heard metal tearing as the trailer swayed dangerously over the edge. The impact threw me forward, and I fought to stay in control. I could feel the weight of the lumber shifting, the whole rig threatening to go over. I had seconds, maybe less. I didn't think. I yanked the gun out from under the seat, kicked open the door, and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the drop-off. The pickup's engine was still running, the headlights casting an eerie glow over the scene. I scrambled to my feet, the gun in my hand, and turned to face the pickup. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in grease and grime, his clothes tattered, hanging off him like they'd been through hell. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I leveled the gun at him, my hands shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted, but he kept coming. Closer now, I could see his face. It was twisted, scarred, like he'd been in 100 fights and lost every one of them. His eyes were cold, empty, like there was nothing human left inside him. He didn't stop. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and the man staggered but didn't go down. He looked at me, more surprised than hurt, and then kept coming. I fired again, and this time he dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. But he wasn't dead. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife, and lunged at me. I fired a third time, hitting him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, finally still. I stood there, gasping for breath, the gun still in my hand. The night was silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I walked over to the pickup, looking for any sign of why he'd chased me, but there was nothing. The cab was empty, no ID, no belongings, just a truck that shouldn't have been running. I looked back at the man, his body lying lifeless on the ground. There was no question he was dead. I had the gun, the spent shells, and his blood on my hands. This wasn't something I could just drive away from. But as I stood there, I realized something else. The rig was teetering on the edge, the weight of the lumber pulling it closer to the drop-off. I ran back to it, climbed inside, and slowly, carefully backed it away from the edge. Once I was clear, I drove back to the main road, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I found a diner that was still open. I sat in a booth, the gun hidden in my jacket, and ordered a coffee. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even the cops. When they eventually found the man's body a few days later, the newspapers called it a tragic accident. An unidentified man found dead in the woods. They never connected it to me, and I never offered up any information. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and got back on the road. The sun was starting to rise, and I had miles to go before my next stop. As I drove, I tried not to think about the man or why he'd come after me. It didn't matter now. He was dead, and I was still alive. That was enough. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler, would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe, out here in the quiet, away from the distractions of phones and the city, we could connect again. You know, like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here, hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness, and now here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. "This is it," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "Cool," he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees, with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. "This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days," I said, trying to make conversation. "A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out." Tyler shrugged. "I guess," he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands. Frustrated. "You know, you could try enjoying this." He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. "I didn't ask to come here." I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. "Let's head back to camp." As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. "What? That light?" It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. Never mind, let's go. The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind, voices, faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside." Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, the unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again. The light. This time it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly, like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. "What? What are you talking about?" The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, let's just go back." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes, stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. "Yeah, let's go." That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the Gold Rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me, the legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain, something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even, but as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were, three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black, the screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me. And I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees here? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same. The same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light. Quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead. A welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints. Dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the frost melted away. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew deep down that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more, something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. I was halfway up Blackwater Ridge when Glenn warned me about the lights. His bait shop was the last stop before the mountain trail turned into pure wilderness, and I dropped in for some extra firewood. He was standing behind the counter, leaning on his elbows, watching me load up my supplies. His words hung in the air long after they left his mouth. "People get lost up there," he said, his voice low and cautious. "You hear the stories?" I zipped up my jacket and shook my head. "What stories?" "About the lights. They show up when the sun goes down, start flickering in the trees like they're leading you somewhere. But you follow them. You don't come back." I should have known better than to brush him off. I should have asked more questions. But the truth was, I didn't care. I wasn't here for ghost stories or local superstitions. I was here to clear my head after everything that had happened with Ryan, the breakup, the endless nights of replaying every argument in my head. I needed this time away from the world. Just me and my RV parked in the middle of nowhere. Blackwater Ridge had seemed perfect, a remote place where no one could find me, and more importantly, where I wouldn't be tempted to find anyone. "I'll be fine," I told Glenn, trying to smile, but his eyes were serious, unblinking. "Just watch yourself," he said, handing me a small pouch as I paid for the wood. "Keep this with you. Some folks say it helps." "What is it?" "Just something my family's passed down," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Might keep the lights away." I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but I pocketed the pouch anyway, more out of politeness than anything else. Then I left the shop, got into my RV, and made my way up the winding mountain road toward Blackwater Ridge. The campsite was exactly what I'd hoped for: deserted, overgrown, and tucked away in a grove of tall pines. The air smelled crisp and clean, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The old campground looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were a few rusted RVs half hidden in the foliage, relics of past campers who had either left them behind or forgotten about them altogether. I parked my RV at the far edge of the grove, close enough to the trees to feel enclosed, but far enough from the abandoned vehicles to avoid any weird vibes. It was perfect, a place to disconnect and forget. That first day was peaceful. I went for a hike, snapped a few photos, and by the time the sun was setting, I was sitting outside by the fire pit, listening to the crackling flames and sipping from a thermos of tea. The sky was clear, and the stars began to poke through the darkness, dotting the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A small flickering light deep in the woods just past the tree line. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but it was too big. It moved slowly, gliding through the trees like it was looking for something or someone. I sat up, narrowing my eyes to focus. The light was faint but unmistakable. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat, its glow barely reaching me through the dense pines. Then another light appeared beside it. Then another. 3 faint orbs flickering in unison, moving deeper into the forest. Glenn's warning about the lights echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. They were probably just campers in the distance, or maybe a reflection from a house far off the ridge. I wasn't about to let some old superstition spook me on my first night. I sat back, trying to relax, but the lights wouldn't leave me alone. They moved again, gliding slowly through the trees as if they were beckoning me to follow. I could almost hear a whisper in the air, like soft voices drifting on the wind. "Come closer." I stood abruptly, shaking my head. "No," I muttered to myself. "You're not doing this. You came here to get away, not chase after stupid lights in the woods." But the longer I stood there, the harder it was to ignore them. They were so gentle, so inviting. It felt like they were calling me, pulling at some part of me that I couldn't explain. My feet shifted forward, inching toward the forest edge. "Come." I blinked, snapping out of it. What was I doing? I wasn't about to follow some strange lights into the woods. Glenn had warned me, hadn't he? I couldn't let myself get sucked into this nonsense. I backed away from the trees, heart pounding, and went back into my RV, slamming the door behind me. The lights flickered one last time outside the window before they disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the morning hiking, trying to focus on anything but what had happened the night before. But the woods felt different now, quieter. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had faded, replaced by a stillness that pressed in on me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees or the faintest flicker of light just out of sight. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting Glenn's warning get under my skin. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the time evening came, the anxiety had settled into my bones. I lit another fire and sat outside, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights came back. This time, they were closer. I watched, frozen, as they flickered between the trees, more of them now. 5, maybe 6, all moving in the same slow, rhythmic pattern. They circled the edge of the campground, their glow soft but persistent. I felt that same pull again, stronger this time, like invisible hands reaching out to me. Come. The whispers were clearer now, louder. They filled my ears, my mind, drowning out everything else. It sounded like his voice, Ryan. His soft, pleading tone asking me to come closer, to follow. I stood, my body moving of its own accord. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was need. I needed to know what these lights were, where they were leading me. Maybe it was Ryan. Maybe he'd followed me, wanted to make things right. The thought was irrational, but in that moment, it made perfect sense. I took a step toward the forest, then another. My heart raced as I approached the tree line, the lights growing brighter, more vivid. But as I crossed into the shadows, something shifted in the air. The forest felt wrong, twisted, like the trees were closing in around me. The lights flickered erratically, their gentle glow turning sharp, jagged. I froze. The whispers turned darker, harsher. Come now. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't Ryan. This was something else, something wrong. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The lights surged forward, surrounding me, blinding me. In desperation, I grabbed the pouch Glenn had given me, clutching it tightly. The lights flickered wildly, then dimmed. I backed away as the whispers receded and the lights finally disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark woods, shaking. I always hated feeling tethered to anything, so when the relationship ended, I knew I had to get away. No more distractions, no more emotional baggage. I just needed a break. Crater Lake seemed perfect, beautiful, isolated, and most importantly, quiet. I packed my old RV, grabbed some hiking gear, and headed out for a long weekend of camping. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to set behind the towering cliffs surrounding the lake. Crater Lake was as stunning as I'd imagined. Deep blue waters, so clear they reflected the sky, encircled by jagged cliffs that loomed like ancient sentinels. The park was busy enough near the main viewpoints, but I was smart. I'd found a campsite far from the crowds, tucked away near the southeastern shore where the trees were thick and the lake was quieter, almost unnervingly so. It was just what I wanted, solitude. But as I parked my RV and set up camp, a strange feeling settled over me. The wind was too still, and even though the lake was calm, there was a low hum in the air, like the whisper of something just out of earshot. I shook it off. Just nerves, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. After all, I hadn't done a solo trip like this since before I met Sarah. The memories tugged at me, but I pushed them away. I spent the first evening by the fire, watching the stars come out as the lake turned to ink. Crater Lake was famous for its clarity, its mirror-like surface reflecting everything above it perfectly. But tonight, the water looked different, darker, maybe even opaque. I stared out across the lake, trying to ignore the strange tightness in my chest when I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, laughter, childlike, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up, listening harder. The night was still, but there it was again, faint but clear. I scanned the shoreline, looking for anyone else camping nearby. Nothing but fog creeping over the water and the flickering shadows of my fire. Probably kids playing somewhere across the lake, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I was too far out. The ranger had said as much when I checked in. This spot was about as secluded as you could get. Besides, the laughter didn't sound right. It was high-pitched, but it echoed strangely, like it was bouncing off the cliffs and the water at the same time. Shaking my head, I stood and stoked the fire, trying to lose myself in the warmth. The sound died away after a few minutes, and eventually I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the wind, or maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive, after all. I crawled into the RV that night, settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful sleep, but the unease stayed with me, clinging to my mind like the fog that now blanketed the campsite. I dreamt of the lake, shapes moving beneath the surface, dark and indistinct. like hands reaching up from the depths. The next day was better. I hiked along the rim of the lake, took in the views, and even managed to shake off some of the weird vibes from the night before. The sunlight was bright and reassuring, cutting through the mist, and the water looked clearer now, less murky. I convinced myself I'd just been tired. That's all it had been. By afternoon, I decided to take the kayak out. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so. The kayak sliced through the surface effortlessly, and for a while, I let myself enjoy it. The silence of the lake was peaceful, broken only by the soft splash of my paddle. Then the ripples started. At first, they were small, nothing more than the gentle rocking of water disturbed by a fish, maybe. But as I moved farther out, the ripples became more pronounced. They seemed to come from nowhere, disturbing the otherwise glassy surface of the lake. I stopped paddling, staring at the water, trying to figure out where they were coming from. There was nothing. No fish, no breeze, no sign of anything that could cause the water to move like that. But the ripples were there, spreading out from somewhere beneath the kayak. That's when I saw it. A dark shape, maybe 15 feet below, moving slowly. It was too large to be a fish and too humanoid to be anything I could easily explain. It floated there for a moment before drifting deeper, vanishing into the darkness. I blinked, gripping my paddle tighter. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was a log, I reasoned, or some weird optical illusion. I was looking through layers of water, after all, and who knew how light refracted down there? But deep down, I didn't believe it. I paddled back to shore faster than I cared to admit, my eyes glued to the water the whole time, watching for any more signs of movement. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to dip, and the fog was rolling in again, thicker this time. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the trees, and with it came that faint sound again. Laughter. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring out into the mist, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was definitely children's voices now, several of them, giggling and splashing. But as I scanned the shoreline, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was no one there. No boats, no campers. Just the fog hanging low over the water like a shroud. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have packed up right then, driven away, and never looked back. But I stayed. Stupid, I know. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Crater Lake had its fair share of myths and legends, but I didn't believe in that stuff. I'd never been the superstitious type. Then I saw them, just shadows at first. Small figures standing at the water's edge, half obscured by the fog. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. They were small, like children, but their outlines were blurred, indistinct. I blinked, trying to focus, and in that split second, they were gone. I stepped back from the shore, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't seeing things. They were there. I'd seen them. A cold chill washed over me as the wind died, leaving the air deathly still. The whispers started again, faint and melodic, drifting across the water. But this time, they were louder, closer. I backed toward the RV, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing behind me. Nothing. I fumbled with the RV door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I sat there in the dim light, listening. The whispers grew louder, like they were pressing in on me from all sides. It was as if the voices were coming from the lake itself, echoing relentlessly. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't stop. The sound seeped into my mind, becoming clearer, more distinct. I could hear the splashing of water and the soft giggles turning into cries. It was children drowning, calling for help. I could hear their little hands slapping against the surface of the water, their desperate gasps for air. My breath hitched, panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I threw my gear into the RV, not caring about the mess, as I reached for the ignition. The RV's lights flickered and died. The engine wouldn't turn over. I cursed under my breath, frantically trying the key again and again. Nothing. Outside, the whispers grew louder. I could hear the faint tapping now, soft knocks against the RV windows. My blood ran cold as I turned. Handprints, small, wet handprints, appeared on the windows, slowly sliding down the glass. The whispers turned into cries. The tapping grew more frantic, louder, as if they were trying to get in, trying to pull me out to the water. I backed away, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with dread. Then I heard it, splashing, close, right outside, like something, was struggling in the water. Without thinking, I rushed to the door, flinging it open. The fog was so thick now I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I could hear the cries for help, the child's voice desperate, calling for me. Help me. Please. My legs carried me toward the lake before my brain could catch up. The water lapped softly at the shore. The cries were louder, more desperate. I could see something out there, flailing in the shallows, a small figure, arms reaching up, struggling against the current. I was almost at the water's edge when the fog shifted just enough for me to see it clearly. The child was translucent, its skin pale and waterlogged. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets. Its mouth was open in a silent scream as it reached for me. Wet, skeletal hands clawed at the water, pulling it closer to me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure stopped struggling, its head tilting to one side as if studying me. Then it smiled, a cold, unnatural smile that chilled me to my core. I ran, my feet pounding the earth as I raced back to the RV. The laughter faded into the distance, echoing through the fog. I slammed the door behind me, locking it again, collapsing to the floor, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers, the laughter, the tapping on the windows, they didn't stop until dawn. When the sun finally broke through the fog, I packed up and drove away without looking back. I didn't care that the RV was barely running or that I left half my gear behind. I just needed to get away from that lake. But even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear them sometimes. The faint whispers, the splashing of water, the laughter. Crater Lake isn't as quiet as it seems, and I know they're still there, waiting. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. This doesn't make sense, I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, their pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey, Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know. They feel weird. Not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place? Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. Sounds like folklore to me. Maybe, Ethan said, his tone serious now. But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you. And the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings. I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. Thanks for the heads up, I said, trying to keep my voice light. But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts. Ethan sighed. Just don't go too deep, okay? Call if you need anything. I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone, as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise, a low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. The sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach knotting with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it, vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern, a rhythmic pulse like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me. Something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it, but the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried. Something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth. And I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be going back. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign, old, weathered wood with the words Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Yeah," I replied, lowering my camera. "It's peaceful." She smiled. "It always is here." "I'm Ellie, by the way." "Nick," I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. "You camping here too?" "For a little while," she said, her voice soft. "I come here every now and then. Can't stay away." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. "You here for the fishing?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. "No, just the lake, the quiet." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone, just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up, listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing. Just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground. And that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. "Ellie?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure. But as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second, she'd been there, and the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she had been standing, but otherwise, the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, as if she already knew. "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from her. "I saw something last night, a woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close." Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. "The Lady of Stillwater." "The what?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. "She's been here for a long time, longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone. Her lover, I think, but he never showed." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "You're telling me she's a ghost?" Ellie shrugged. "Call it what you want, but she's real. And now that you've seen her, she won't let you go." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "That's insane." "Is it?" Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. "You saw her. You know she's real." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. "What does she want?" I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. "She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water." That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming drifting through the night air, then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Please, come." I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Come with me," she said again, her voice almost pleading now. "I've waited so long. I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving. the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. "You have to leave," she said, her voice urgent now. "Before it's too late." I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is happening?" I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. "She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go." I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable, and behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again.